Power without accountability creates monsters. And right now, we're watching Donald Trump's Greenland obsession transform from a constitutional crisis into something far more dangerous, a vengeful purge of his own party. The loyalty Trump demanded from Senate Republicans for years, he's now weaponizing it against them because they dared to choose the Constitution over his fantasy of invading a sovereign nation. And what those same Republicans are learning today is that Trump's loyalty was always a trap, a one-way street where subservience flows upward, but protection never flows down. This isn't just about Greenland anymore. This is about a president declaring war on his own party, and he just claimed his first victim. We're going to expose every brutal detail. But before we do, if you could leave a like on this video and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, it goes a long way in supporting this work. Now, it was Rand Paul who revealed that not a single Republican senator supports Trump's Greenland invasion plan. But before that truth could fully detonate, Mike Johnson rushed to the cameras to perform damage control. He's gaslighting the American people, trying to convince us that what we're seeing with our own eyes isn't actually happening. And it's critical to understand what he said here before we dive into the Senate revolt and Trump's retaliation.
Okay, let me address them in turn. We're not at war with Greenland. We have no intention of being it. We have no reason to be at war with Greenland, okay? Everybody knows there's geopolitical and strategic importance of that landmass, and that's what everyone has talked about. By the way, this is not just President Trump. I think this goes back to Truman. Like many presidents have acknowledged the strategic placement of Greenland and how important that could be to our country. And the president's talked about that, rare earth minerals and other things. They're talking about diplomatic channels for this, okay? There's lots been said about it, but I know this personally because I talked to the governor of my state a couple of days ago, Jeff Landry, who has been appointed to be our person there, our individual who would go and help with these negotiations.
So Mike Johnson wants you to believe this is all media hysteria, that Trump's threats to seize Greenland through military force or economic coercion are just Democrats twisting his words, not Trump's own unhinged declarations being played back verbatim. That's the story they're trying to sell. But here's what Johnson won't address. Why would Trump be threatening unconstitutional tariffs as a weapon if this is just diplomatic channels? Why would he be cage-rattling with a NATO ally if there's no intention of being at war? Trump himself argued to the Supreme Court that he needs these tariffs for national security purposes. You don't weaponize national security tariffs against friendly nations unless you're preparing for conflict. And when the most hawkish Republicans in the Senate said absolutely not to this madness, when they chose the Constitution's war powers and trade clauses over Trump's mineral-hungry delusions, Trump didn't accept defeat. He did what he always does when loyalty isn't returned with blind obedience. He declared war on the dissenters themselves. Senator Bill Cassidy just learned this the hard way. His crime? Voting to impeach Trump years ago and refusing to endorse the Greenland invasion. Trump's punishment? Endorsing Cassidy's primary challenger to literally steal his job, sending a crystal-clear message to every other Republican senator, fall in line or I'll end your career. This is the collective action problem that has paralyzed the Republican Party for years. They can't stand together, so Trump picks them off one by one. And what's mind-boggling is that they're still surprised when the monster they created, fed, and protected for nearly a decade turns around and devours them. But Trump's aggression isn't contained to Greenland or Senate primaries. The same unhinged energy, the same disregard for law and human dignity is being channeled through the enforcement arm he's unleashed on America, ICE. And that's where this story takes its darkest turn. Because the monster isn't just eating the Republican Party, it's conducting a crusade against the very soul of this country. The question isn't whether we can tweak this system or reform it around the edges. The question is whether we have the courage to admit what needs to happen. Complete dismantling, total severance, cutting out the rot before it spreads beyond repair. Donald Trump's political operation runs on a simple transaction. You give everything, and he gives nothing. It's the most one-sided contract in American politics, and for years, Republicans signed it anyway. They defended his lies, they covered for his crimes, they prostrated themselves on television to prove their devotion. And what did they get in return? The privilege of being useful until the moment they weren't. This is the loyalty clause that governs Trump's world. When you're valuable to him, when you're amplifying his message or blocking investigations or confirming his judges, he'll let you bask in his orbit. He might even throw you a nickname, post about you on social media, hold a rally in your state. But the second you hesitate, the second you prioritize your oath to the Constitution over your fealty to him, that protection evaporates. You become the enemy. And Trump doesn't just abandon enemies, he destroys them. We've watched this pattern for nearly a decade. Jeff Sessions, once Trump's earliest Senate supporter, was publicly humiliated and cast aside for recusing himself from the Russia investigation. Bill Barr, who bent the Justice Department into a personal law firm for Trump, was discarded the moment he admitted there was no widespread election fraud. Mike Pence, the most obsequious vice president in modern history, was left to face a murderous mob chanting for his execution because he wouldn't overturn an election. Trump didn't lift a finger to protect any of them. The math is brutally simple. Trump's loyalty flows in one direction only, upward toward himself. Everyone else is expendable. And the Republicans now revolting over Greenland are finally doing the calculation they should have done years ago. They're realizing they were never partners. They were always marks. So what finally broke them? What made the most pro-military interventionist America First Republicans in the Senate look at Donald Trump's Greenland scheme and say, absolutely not? It wasn't moral clarity. It wasn't a sudden discovery of constitutional principles. It was the dawning realization that this plan was so catastrophically stupid, so internationally humiliating, so legally indefensible, that even they couldn't spin it. Rand Paul said it out loud. Not a single Republican senator supports the idea of purchasing or invading Greenland. Not one. These are the same people who rubber-stamped every Trump tariff, every military authorization, every executive overreach for years. But Greenland was a bridge too far, and here's why. First, you can't buy a country that isn't for sale. Denmark has said no repeatedly, and Greenland's government has made it crystal clear they have zero interest in becoming an American territory. Trump's response? Threaten them with tariffs and military posturing. That's not negotiation. That's extortion with a NATO ally. Second, the hawks understand something Trump apparently doesn't. You can't bully your way into strategic alliances. Greenland's geographic position and rare earth minerals are valuable precisely because of international cooperation and trust. The moment you start cage-rattling and threatening invasion, you don't just lose Greenland. You lose Denmark. You fracture NATO. You signal to every ally that America's word means nothing. Third, and this is what finally penetrated their skulls, Trump's plan has no legal foundation. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war and regulate commerce with foreign nations. Trump can't unilaterally impose tariffs as a weapon to force territorial acquisition. He can't threaten military action without congressional authorization. This isn't creative executive power. This is a constitutional crisis with Trump as the aggressor. Even the most hawkish Republicans aren't willing to shred the Constitution for rare earth minerals and a narcissist's territorial fantasy. But Mike Johnson needs you to believe none of this is real. He needs you to think the media invented this crisis, that Democrats are hysterically overreacting to harmless diplomatic discussion, that your lying eyes are deceiving you. This is gaslighting in its purest form. And Johnson delivered it with the practiced calm of someone who's made peace with dishonesty. Watch how he does it. First, he dismisses the premise entirely. We're not at war with Greenland, he says, as if the problem is that critics think troops are already deployed rather than that the president is threatening to deploy them. It's a classic misdirection, reframing the concern as something absurd so the actual concern sounds equally absurd by association. Then he wraps it in historical legitimacy. This goes back to Truman, he reminds us. Many presidents have discussed Greenland's strategic importance, and that's technically true, but it's also completely irrelevant. Truman didn't threaten NATO allies with tariffs. Previous presidents didn't publicly muse about military invasion. They explored quiet diplomatic channels that respected sovereignty. Trump is doing the opposite, and Johnson knows it. Finally, Johnson offers you a bureaucratic security blanket. He's appointed Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry to handle negotiations. See? It's all official and proper and diplomatic. Except diplomacy doesn't start with threats. Diplomacy doesn't involve weaponizing tariffs against allies. And diplomacy certainly doesn't include the President of the United States publicly fantasizing about invading a territory because he wants its minerals. Johnson's entire performance is designed to make you doubt your own perception. Trump said what he said. He threatened what he threatened. The tariffs are real. The constitutional violations are real. The Senate revolt is real. But Johnson needs you to believe it's all just noise. All just misunderstanding, all just the media creating drama where none exists. It's not working anymore. The gaslighting is too obvious and the flames are too high. And those flames are being fueled by something most Americans don't fully understand. Trump's tariffs aren't just bad policy. They're unconstitutional weapons being deployed against allies to force territorial surrender. This isn't about protecting American industry or leveling trade imbalances. This is economic warfare dressed up in national security language to bypass Congress entirely. Here's how the con works. The Constitution explicitly gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and to lay and collect taxes and duties. The founders were crystal clear about this because they'd just escaped a king who could unilaterally impose taxes as punishment. They built the separation of powers specifically to prevent one person from weaponizing the economy against perceived enemies. But Trump found a loophole. Or more accurately, he's abusing an exception. There's a provision that allows the president to impose tariffs for genuine national security emergencies. The key word is genuine. It was designed for scenarios like an imminent attack or a critical supply chain collapse that threatens military readiness. It was never intended as a tool to bully Denmark into selling Greenland. Trump's own argument to the Supreme Court reveals the fraud. He claims these tariffs are necessary for national security purposes. But Greenland isn't threatening America. Denmark is a NATO ally. There's no security emergency here except the one Trump is manufacturing. He's taking a narrow emergency power and stretching it into a blank check to impose economic sanctions on any country that won't give him what he wants. This is taxation without representation on an international scale. Congress hasn't authorized these tariffs. The American people, through their elected representatives, haven't approved using economic coercion to acquire foreign territory. Trump is acting as both legislature and executive, consolidating powers the Constitution deliberately separated. And when you bypass constitutional checks to threaten allies with economic destruction unless they surrender their land, you're not protecting national security, you're obliterating it. Rand Paul understands what Trump apparently never learned in decades of real estate deals. You don't close negotiations by screaming threats at the other party. You don't secure strategic partnerships by publicly humiliating your potential partners. And you certainly don't convince someone to sell you something by threatening to take it by force if they refuse. Paul's critique cuts to the bone because it exposes how fundamentally backwards Trump's approach is. If you genuinely wanted to explore acquiring Greenland through diplomatic channels, you would start with quiet conversations, respect for sovereignty, and acknowledging the legitimate interests of Denmark and Greenland's government. You would build trust. You would demonstrate that American partnership offers benefits that make cooperation attractive. Instead, Trump opened with public demands, followed by insults when Denmark declined, then escalated to threatening tariffs and military posturing. He's not negotiating. He's cage-rattling, trying to intimidate and bully a much smaller nation into submission through sheer aggressive spectacle. And as Paul pointed out, that doesn't make them want to work with you. It makes them run in the opposite direction. This is the same pattern we've seen with every international relationship Trump touches. Berate allies, praise dictators, mistake aggression for strength, confuse dominance with leadership. It's not diplomacy. It's a protection racket mentality applied to geopolitics, where Trump genuinely believes that threatening harm is the same thing as offering value. But here's what cage rattling actually accomplishes. It alienates the very countries whose cooperation you need. It signals to the world that America's word is worthless and its partnerships are conditional on submission. It turns potential allies into confirmed adversaries. Denmark isn't going to sell Greenland because Trump yelled louder. They're going to strengthen their ties with other NATO members and build defensive coalitions against American aggression. You don't get buyers by berating them. You get enemies. And Trump just manufactured one where none existed before. Bill Cassidy is learning what happens when you choose the Constitution over Trump's ego. The Louisiana senator voted to convict Trump during the second impeachment trial, one of only 7 Republicans willing to hold a president accountable for inciting an insurrection. That vote was years ago, but Trump's memory for perceived betrayal is infinite, and his capacity for forgiveness is non-existent. Now, as Senate Republicans openly revolt against the Greenland invasion fantasy, Trump has decided to make an example of Cassidy. He's not just criticizing him. He's not just withholding support. Trump has gone nuclear, endorsing a primary challenger with the explicit goal of ending Cassidy's career. This is political assassination, a public execution designed to send a message to every other Republican senator considering defiance: I will destroy you. The endorsement itself is almost irrelevant to Trump's actual preference for the challenger. What matters is the demonstration of power, the performance of vengeance. Trump is showing the Republican caucus that he can reach into their states, mobilize his base against them, and cost them their seats. He's proving that the loyalty clause has teeth, that there is always a price for choosing principle over subservience. And the timing is calculated for maximum intimidation. Right as senators are breaking ranks on Greenland, right as the revolt threatens to spread, Trump picks off one of the defectors to remind the others what rebellion costs. It's strategic cruelty, designed to isolate dissenters and make collective resistance psychologically impossible. Cassidy's sacrifice reveals the fundamental trap Republicans built for themselves. They spent years elevating Trump's power over their own institutional authority. They fed the base's cult of personality. They surrendered their independence piece by piece, thinking they could control it or benefit from it. Now they're discovering that the monster they created doesn't negotiate, it consumes. And Trump isn't done. Cassidy is just the first course. This is the collective action problem that should have been solved in 2016, and it's mind-boggling that Republicans still haven't learned the lesson. They have the numbers. They have the constitutional authority. If they stood together, they could stop Trump cold. The Senate alone could refuse to confirm his appointments, block his legislative priorities, override his vetoes, even remove him from office if they wanted. 20 Republican senators voting with Democrats would end this entire nightmare overnight. But they won't do it. They can't do it. Because collective action requires trust, coordination, and a willingness to absorb short-term pain for long-term survival. And Trump has systematically destroyed all 3 prerequisites within his own party. Here's how the trap works. Each individual senator looks at their own political calculus and decides that defying Trump isn't worth the risk. They see what happened to Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, every Republican who stood up and got destroyed. They know Trump's base will primary them. They know the fundraising will dry up. They know they'll be called traitors and rhinos and worse. So they stay quiet, hoping someone else will take the risk of leadership. But when everyone makes that same calculation, when everyone waits for someone else to go first, no one moves. Trump picks them off individually because they refuse to create collective protection. Cassidy falls alone because the other senators won't stand with him. And when Cassidy falls, the next target becomes even more isolated, even more vulnerable. The Republicans created this prison themselves. They empowered Trump to punish dissent. They fed his cult of personality. They normalized his vengeance. Now they're shocked that he's using those weapons against them, as if loyalty was ever anything but a one-way transaction with a narcissist who views relationships purely as dominance hierarchies. They could stop him today if they wanted. They just have to be willing to hang together instead of letting Trump hang them separately. But Trump's aggression isn't contained to punishing disloyal senators or bullying NATO allies. The same unhinged energy, the same authoritarian impulse, the same complete disregard for law and human dignity is being channeled through the enforcement arm he's unleashed on American soil, ICE. And this is where the monster's shadow grows darkest, because what's happening isn't immigration enforcement. It's a campaign of terror against vulnerable communities with zero accountability. ICE is operating like Trump's personal militia, empowered to act without oversight, without restraint, without consequences. They're conducting raids in schools and hospitals, places that were previously considered off-limits, even under the harshest immigration policies. They're separating families without documentation, losing track of children, creating a humanitarian catastrophe that would be called ethnic cleansing if it happened anywhere else. And when questioned, when challenged, when confronted with evidence of abuse, ICE simply shrugs and continues. This is what unaccountable power looks like in practice. Trump doesn't need to personally order every raid or approve every separation. He just has to create an environment where cruelty is rewarded, where agents understand that aggression will be celebrated rather than punished, where the normal guardrails of law and decency have been explicitly removed. The monster doesn't need to be everywhere. It just needs to cast a shadow long enough that people operating in that darkness feel licensed to act on their worst impulses. And the parallel to Greenland is exact. Trump threatens allies with economic warfare. ICE terrorizes immigrant communities with physical force, but the methodology is identical. Consolidate power, eliminate accountability, use fear as a weapon, and punish anyone who resists. The same authoritarian playbook deployed on different battlefields. The question isn't whether this is sustainable. The question is how much damage gets done before it collapses. The question isn't whether we can tweak this system or reform it around the edges. The question is whether we have the courage to admit what needs to happen. Complete dismantling, total severance, cutting out the rot before it spreads beyond repair. ICE isn't a broken agency that needs better training or stricter oversight. It's a malignant organ that's poisoning the entire body, and the only treatment is removal. Think about what happens when you have a failed organ transplant. Your body recognizes the foreign tissue as a threat, tries to fight it, but the rejection causes systemic damage. You don't rehabilitate a rejected organ. You don't send it to therapy or give it new guidelines. You cut it out before it kills you. That's where we are with ICE and the Trump ideology it embodies. This isn't hyperbole. We're watching an enforcement agency operate with the mindset of an occupying military force in American communities. We're seeing constitutional rights suspended based on nothing more than appearance or language. We're witnessing families destroyed, children traumatized, lives shattered, all in service of a white nationalist fever dream wrapped in the language of law and order. And every day this continues, the infection spreads deeper into our institutions, our culture, our national character. Reform assumes the underlying structure is sound, but what if the structure itself is the problem? What if ICE was designed to do exactly what it's doing, just with a thinner veneer of legitimacy? The agency was born from the post-9/11 security panic, built to prioritize enforcement over humanity, given broad powers with minimal accountability. Trump didn't corrupt ICE. He just gave it permission to be what it always wanted to be. Cutting it out means abolition. Full stop. Not reorganization, not rebranding, not promising to do better next time. It means acknowledging that some things can't be saved and shouldn't be.